to the 8th annual Joe R. Sexton Lecture. For those of you who remember Joe, he was curious. I mean, there's lots of good things you can say about him. He volunteered faithfully with our Friends Committee putting the Books for Baby packets together. And he had lots of other things. He had a big social life, but he was curious. And so when the idea of having this lecture series in his name came about, we were very excited about it because we know there's a breadth of stuff that we can talk about, and he would be interested in all of that. He was a World War II Navy pilot. He was an engineer. He lived in the Far East. He ended up here in Stanford with us, and we were very lucky to have him. What makes this lecture also very special, because if you've been to other lectures at the library, you know we don't always have wine and food, and sometimes not even goldfish, is that we had a very generous donor who's with us tonight, Mel Klugman, who's underwriting this lecture series, and that has allowed us to bring in scholars from across the country in order to speak at this lecture. So thank you, Mel. So anybody who's talked to me in the last 3 years knows that I am obsessed with Librarians as Spies, and the number of great books there are around here. But to introduce our guest speaker tonight, I'm going to hand it over to Susan LaPerla, Director of Public Services.
Thank you, Alex. Good evening, and thanks to all of you for coming. It's great to see a full room. We were at capacity for this event, so I know that there is an interest in the subject. And I'm also really pleased to say that this is the first woman that we've had speaking as a Joe R. Sexton Lecture Series. So great, and she wrote about librarians. Great, so it's a good day. So I'll tell you a little bit about Elyse. Elyse Graham is a historian and professor at Stony Brook University, a flagship university in the SUNY system. She holds degrees from Princeton, Yale, and MIT, and has learned how scholars whisper, scheme, launder information, and guard secrets. She will explain exactly how when she tells us about her latest book, Book and Dagger, How Scholars and Librarians Became the Unlikely Spies of World War II. Book and Dagger tells the previously untold story of the academics who became OSS spies, invented modern spycraft, and helped turn the tide of World War II, drawing on personal histories, letters, and declassified files to tell the story of a small but connected group of humanities scholars turned spies. Among them are Joseph Curtis, a literature professor who hunted down German spies and turned them into double agents, Sherman Kent, a smart-mouth history professor, who rose to become the head of analysis for all of Europe and Africa, and Adele Kibre, an archivist who was sent to Stockholm to secretly acquire documents for the OSS. These unforgettable characters would ultimately help lay the foundation of modern intelligence and transform American higher education when they returned after the war. In addition to Book and Dagger, Elyse is the author of 3 academic books: You Talkin' to Me, A Unified Theory of Cats on the Internet, and The Republic of Games. So please join me in welcoming Elyse to the Ferguson Lecture.
You guys can hear me? Hello, today I'm here to talk to you about World War II, hello. Today I'm here to talk to you about World War II, librarians, and the story of how they saved the world and invented modern spycraft. The amazing thing about this story is it really did happen. The OSS, the predecessor to today's Central Intelligence Agency, really did recruit the nation's most bookish types to become secret agents in dangerous undercover missions abroad. These were missions that required their knowledge and love of books, just as a fighter pilot's mission requires a knowledge of planes. The book I wrote on the subject follows a small, interconnected group of people, but the OSS recruited hundreds of them, mild-mannered professors and oddball archivists and restless librarians. Because America had no standing intelligence agency at the start of the war and needed to build up an instant bank of expertise on every subject in the library, the OSS simply raided the library for recruits. These bookish types were pulled into the Cloak and Dagger Brigade and trained, in the words of one contemporary, in all the black arts of mystery, deception, and mayhem. Their adventures took them, and the saboteurs, swindlers, and human smugglers they found themselves suddenly collaborating with, to the covered bazaars of Istanbul, a secretive legation in Stockholm, a salt mine in Austria, a seedy cafe in Marseille, an impossibly posh spy training camp near London, a deception training camp outside of Los Angeles that might as well have been a studio lot, a power plant hidden in the snowy mountains of Norway that the Nazis were using in a scheme to develop a secret weapon. But above all, their adventures took them through the world of books. Because I knew there would be book lovers here today, I actually brought books to pass around. These are all books from the period of World War II, and they're all meaningful to World War II, especially the period spycraft, because of some aspect of their bookishness. The first example that I'll give is this book, My 3 Years with Eisenhower by Harry Butcher. This was published in 1946, just after the end of the war. At the time, a lot of aspects of the war were still classified, including the code names of the big military operations. Here, you can pass this around. So Operation Fortitude, for instance, a deception operation that disguised the preparations for the D-Day landings by making it look like the Allies wanted to land in Norway, not France. That code name was still classified. Nobody was supposed to know what it was. Nobody was supposed to know about the Fortitude operations either. Some of these secrets remained classified for decades. Now, the first lesson about spycraft that I want to teach you is secrets aren't secure. If you have assets or information that you want to protect from others, you should try as much as possible to keep whatever system you use to protect those secrets from depending on things like code names or passwords, because people are terrible at keeping secrets, which is demonstrated by this book. It was written by a former aide of General Dwight Eisenhower who knew all about Fortitude, and before it was published, US intelligence went through it and cut out every reference to Fortitude. But they forgot to check the book's index. So, there it is, the secret got out. Books can reveal all kinds of things if you just know how to use them. Let's go back to the beginning. One day in early 1942, government agents marched into the New York Public Library and demanded to see its collections of maps. The same scene was playing out at libraries all over the country. A librarian at UCLA later recalled hearing stories from his elders of coming to work and finding that the map library had suddenly become a top security area protected by 24-hour armed guards. These agents were probably members of Research and Analysis, which was the intelligence analysis division of the OSS, the predecessor to today's Central Intelligence Agency. At the time, R&A agents were hunting through libraries and confiscating all kinds of books. Travel books, phone books, scientific books, industry directories, even sometimes novels. But maps provide an especially potent example as to why. In 1941, when the United States entered the war, the US had just 2 sets of maps showing all of Japan. You need maps in order to fight a war. If you have soldiers landing on the shore of some town in North Africa, you need to know what the roads are into and out of town, where you might be ambushed by retreating Axis troops, what buildings you need to prioritize capturing, like the hospital and the telegraph office. You cannot strategize without maps. You can't put boots on the ground unless you first put ground under the boots. And in the area of maps, as in many other areas, US libraries were utterly deficient. They had been taking for granted that if professors, let's say, really wanted to look at a source, they could go to Europe. But after the war started, that wasn't possible. The military was deficient too. The Army Corps of Engineers, which had been making most of the maps the military used, had a budget before the war that provided for 2 cartographers. Because of this, during the war, making maps was a huge component of the work of R&A geographers who passed endless hours copying historical maps in the New York Public Library. They drew situation maps every day for the War Department. They drew reference maps and thematic maps to accompany the reports that R&A wrote at the request of military and government officials. They drew maps to propose strategic elements of upcoming military operations. And they used, in ingenious ways, whatever maps they could get their hands on, maps that were never meant to be used in war. This map, for instance, which is a whaling map that the Wilkes expedition published in the 19th century. It's a copper plate engraving. The surveyors got their measurements by firing guns from ships and listening for the echo. Herman Melville used it while writing Moby Dick. Not ideal lumber for the age of radar. This is what they had to work with, and remarkably, they made it work. So, lesson 2 of spycraft. It's a lesson that professors know all too well. The answers might be right in front of you, but you won't see them unless you do the reading. Nothing in the library is unimportant. I am now passing around some more books from this period. This is an atlas that R&A used in war planning. I don't know whether it was that specific book, but it was that atlas. It's from 1922. Now, R&A agents worked in the New York Public Library, but they also worked in Rockefeller Center, which was the secret OSS headquarters in New York City. So if you can imagine a boy, they used very young couriers, going down 6th Avenue from the New York Public Library to the secret OSS headquarters, carrying, to the amusement of everyone he passes, a book so large that it might as well be a table. This is Sweden on $50, which is a guidebook that includes maps. This is a tourist's guide to Istanbul, which also contains maps. All right? And books like these had other very valuable information, like where the railway station was, where are the train tracks that you might need to sabotage during a battle to keep Axis reinforcements from arriving. Here's another book, just a street directory for Casablanca, that contains, if you just look, addresses for every Casablanca business that you need to sabotage or occupy. Matériel de chemin de fer, that's railway equipment. Société Française de Munitions de Chasse de Tir et de Guerre, that's French for munitions factory. All the post, telegraph, and telephone offices that could give up the whole goose, the electric works, the Red Cross pharmacy, a full map of every borough, port, and railroad that runs from Morocco to France. Everything you might need, hidden in plain sight at the New York Public Library. Now, the OSS also sent professors and librarians abroad on secret undercover missions. In the book, I focus on a small but connected group of these library rats turned unlikely spies. They include Joseph Curtis, a literature professor who hunted down German spies and turned them into double agents, and Adele Kibre, an archivist who was sent to Stockholm to secretly acquire documents for the OSS. Although he stayed in Washington, I also want to mention Sherman Kent, a smart-mouthed history professor who rose to become the head of intelligence analysis for all of Europe and Africa. We'll get back to him later. Let's suppose that it's 1942 and you've been pulled out of your library to become a spy. And it did happen like that. You'd get a call at the library, or a government agent would show up at the door to your classroom while you were teaching, or someone would come to recruit you during a school football game when nobody would notice another alumni-looking dude walking around campus in a suit. How did they teach you, who have no actual fighting experience, to be a spy? First, they'd send you to a training camp. So, Joseph Curtis, literature professor at Yale. One day in August 1942, the head of his department paid him a visit in his faculty apartment at a residential college. He said, listen, you have to go to the Yale Club in New York City tomorrow. You have to wear a purple tie. You're going to see a man light a cigarette and then put it out. Talk to that man. He has a message for you. As ridiculous as it sounds, as much like a spy story as it sounds, that's how he got recruited. As it turns out, because the people training and recruiting these spies were often new to spycraft themselves, they got a lot of their ideas from spy fiction. Recruitment felt straight out of a spy novel because that's where they got their playbook. As the book historian Robert Darton says,
very heavy.
Literature doesn't just reflect upon history, literature creates history. So, you'd recognize your mysterious contact because he was wearing a red carnation, or because he was holding a Penguin paperback with its distinctive orange cover. All right? Or, let's see where I am. Or he might also be holding a newspaper. This one is very old, don't worry. And how he held the newspaper was a signal. If he was holding it folded under his arm, it was safe to meet. If the newspaper was sticking out of his overcoat pocket, he was being followed and you should pretend not to know him. After you joined the OSS, you'd be sent to a spy training camp. The English had spy training schools that were incredibly posh. They were in country manners and had housemasters and servants as such. The Americans had camps with tents in national parks, which had terrain that could support combat exercises as well as enough seclusion to keep the goings-on secret. A totally different experience. But the English sent over their fighting instructors to teach the American spies how to fight. So you, as a professor, as a librarian, would be learning how to do the kind of close combat that leaves the other person not injured, but dead. I'm passing around some of the fighting manuals that those instructors wrote. I wish to note that these manuals assume that in the field you will not have a weapon on you. If you're a spy, you can have either a cover story or a weapon, but you can't have both. If the Gestapo arrests you and you're carrying a shoe that turns into a radio transmitter or a lipstick that turns into a gun, they will not believe that you are just a civilian. So, you were taught how to use ordinary objects as weapons, how to kill someone with a newspaper, how to restrain someone with their own trousers. You also learned how to take weapons from other people, but the assumption was that you'd be out in the field with only your wits to protect you. This wasn't like James Bond with all his cool gadgets. After his training, Joseph Curtis went to Istanbul. Adele Kibre went to Stockholm. Her job was to acquire documents that the Allies could use to develop intelligence and plan covert operations. Because a war was happening, you could no longer get things like newspapers or books or scientific journals from Germany or other Axis countries. Not if you were in the United States. And as ingenious as the library rats were who were working with existing materials in the New York Public Library and elsewhere, there was still a pressing need to supplement their work by secretly acquiring materials abroad. Sweden was a neutral country, but it was filled with German documents. The Germans very badly wanted Swedes to believe that Americans were ruffians who had no concept of culture, that if they won, they would tear down the libraries and concert halls of Europe. And so the Germans sent to Stockholm, as proof of their own culture with a K, professors to give lectures wearing little round glasses, conductors to wave batons over performances of the magic flute. They made sure their scientific and technical journals flowed without wartime interruption into Sweden's libraries and universities, so that Swedish intellectuals would understand that scientific progress spoke the German language. This was a gap in the German defenses that Kibre could take advantage of. Even though Sweden was a neutral country, Kibre had to work undercover. Sweden had made a deal with the warring countries that it could maintain its neutrality as long as no spies operated in Sweden. Moreover, Sweden's sentiments tilted toward the Axis. The Swedish police were aligned with the Gestapo and had even trained with the Gestapo. If a spy was caught by the Swedish police, they faced arrest, imprisonment, deportation, even Gestapo-style beatings and interrogations. Stockholm was neutral, but it wasn't impartial, and it was far from a safe place to be a spy. But Kibre had, without knowing it, been training her whole life for exactly this mission. Kibre had a PhD in classics from the University of Chicago, and because women couldn't really go into the professoriate in those years, she became a professional archive hunter, hopping from archive to archive across Europe, earning money by taking photographs of rare texts for scholars back home in the States, who did not have, in those days before the internet, any other way of seeing such texts besides visiting the archives themselves. By the time she was recruited by the OSS, she had been doing this for almost a decade. Kibre's cover in Stockholm was that she was looking for books to add to the collections of the Library of Congress. Normal books, nothing to do with intelligence. Another rule of spycraft. A spy has to perform their cover as competently as the spycraft, which means if someone is pretending to work for a library, it's best that she has experience working with libraries. She acquired and secretly sent home on microfilm all kinds of documents that she should not have gotten access to. Industry directories, trade magazines, railway schedules, German newspapers, atlases, maps, technical journals, German newsletters that were on a restricted list and only went to certain vetted subscribers, underground resistance literature, privately printed books, books that had been printed by underground presses, and books that the German government had designated secret books and pulled from circulation, current newspapers as well as back issues dating to 1940, publications on aeronautics, banking, bibliography, electronics, governance, finance, international relations, labor, law, legislation, metallurgy, mining, politics, regulation, shipbuilding, statistics, synthetic petroleum, and scientific publications of every description. Here is one of those industry directories. It's an industry directory for Berlin for 1942. And if you're asking, what's the use of a Berlin industry directory? It was used to find the addresses of the factories that produced ball bearings. And when you ask, what's the use of ball bearings? Ball bearings were used to manufacture fighter planes and tanks and gun carriages and all the moving parts of Hitler's war machine. If you bomb a factory that makes fighter planes, you've only disabled a factory that makes fighter planes. But if you bomb a factory that makes ball bearings, you've disabled all the factories that use ball bearings to make other things, including the factory that makes fighter planes. There's some ball bearings from the war. Those are literally World War II ball bearings. I would never give you any less. I'm not kidding when I say that a whole subplot of World War II consisted of trying to get control of ball bearings. Kibre was a rare and extraordinary talent. She was the most productive document acquisitions agent of the war. And when you ask, how did she get so good at this? I'd like you to consider that libraries are not only places to reveal information, not only places to store information, they are places to hide information. For example, in the 18th century, a historian named Edmund Malone was writing a biography of Shakespeare, and he had all of these ideas about how playwriting happened in Shakespeare's time. And then he finds in the library the diary of an Elizabethan playwright named Philip Henslowe, and he learns that in Shakespeare's time, the process of writing plays was not exactly the way that he thought that it was. It was too late to change the biography, the book was set to come out, so he didn't return the book to the library. He kept the diary, it was only returned after his death. I can give other examples. There's a university in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the faculty of the English department takes turns going to the library and reshelving a novel that contains juicy gossip about them, so that nobody can find it. Or again, at the National Archives, the catalog for the OSS records was made with the help of OSS veterans. This was a good service to history, but they often cataloged the names of men and not the names of women, which means that women's papers are in the archive, but their names aren't findable in the catalog. Or again, for decades, women who have gone to do research at the Vatican archives, where you speak to church officials who decide your access to the books, have advised each other that you get better treatment if when you go to ask, you take off your wedding ring. In short, all the guys are like, I don't get it. All the women are like, I don't get it. In short, the work of getting archives to reveal their secrets requires a far more complicated set of moves than simply going to the shelf and looking at the catalog. It can require the work of a real bibliographic detective. Adele Kibre understood this. She went to the Vatican archives herself in her pre-war life as a freelance archive hunter. In 1940, when she asked to see an especially rare manuscript in the Vatican archives, an attendant was horrified, in the words of a contemporary account. He explained that only a certain cardinal could grant such permission. Miss Kibre immediately asked to see the cardinal. This horrified the attendant even more. Unfazed, Kibre, the daughter of movie set designers, sent a tempting card of introduction up to his eminence. Miss Adele Kibre, Hollywood, California. A minute later, the attendant came down looking abashed. The cardinal had sent for her, saying, "So, you are from Hollywood. Come, let's talk." She amused the cardinal with an hour and a half of gossip about studio intrigue, and then she got the blessing that she needed to see the manuscript. We'll move now to Joseph Curtis, but the last thing I want to mention about Kibre is that she was working a lot of different people and crafting a different persona for each. She went around to the library for Sweden's Royal Institute of Technology, the Karolinska Institute Bibliotek, the oldest medical library in Stockholm, which held all manner of medical books, as well as a marvelous archive of rare books, the library for the Royal Veterinary College of Sweden, which had the medical books that the Karolinska Institute didn't, a civil statistics office, and all kinds of local libraries, because you never know when a book will wash up on the hidden shore of some neighborhood library nobody bothered to check. She made friends with librarians, which is evident from the huge numbers of books that she started to send back in microfilm to the OSS with the notation confidentially borrowed. She made friends with rare book dealers. I am now going to pass around some actual catalogs from the dealers that she worked with. And she convinced the ones who were on the side of the Germans that she was on the side of the Germans too. She made contacts in the Norwegian underground. She was rumored to have slipped into occupied France on a fishing boat. A real example of how little daylight there is between a good library rat and a good spy. Okay, Joseph Curtis. He taught literature at Yale. He was very much a hothouse flower. He was born and died in the same house, which you can only do if you're very poor or very wealthy. He was very wealthy. He went to Yale for undergrad, then grad school, then became a professor there. He was a Connecticut guy. Might have gathered from the hints. He lived on campus, had a very genteel, very cozy, very safe little life of letters. And then he was pulled out of that life, trained as a spy, and thrown into wartime Istanbul. Turkey, like Sweden, was neutral territory, although each country sustained neutrality in the war by following opposite policies on espionage. The Swedish government asked the warring countries how Sweden could stay out of the war, and the reply was that Sweden could stay out of the war if it let nobody's spies operate in its territory. The Turkish government asked the warring countries how Turkey could stay out of the war, and the reply was that Turkey could remain neutral if it let everybody's spies operate in its territory. Turkey agreed, and so although spies were running around in both countries, the spies in Stockholm had to work totally underground, whereas Istanbul was a world where everyone was presumed to be a spy. 17 different spy agencies operated in Istanbul. Their agents often sat at adjoining restaurant tables, trying to eavesdrop on each other's conversation while the waiter eavesdropped on them both. In a world like that, your cover is more important, not less. Curtis's cover was that he was a Yale professor who had been sent to Istanbul to collect books for Yale's library. He went around to the city's bookshops, taught a few classes at the local university. This is a picture of Istanbul's old book bazaar, which is just off the Grand Bazaar, and is a very beautiful place. His actual job was to hunt down German spies and turn them into double agents. The story of how he fell into that job has a lot of twists and turns. He was supposed to have a job like Kibre's, document hunting, but the Istanbul outpost of the OSS imploded just before he got there, because the outpost director thought he was James Bond and was sleeping with his sources, and his sources were enemy agents. The guy's cover was broken so thoroughly that every time he went into one of the city's nightclubs, the band would start playing a song called Boo Boo Baby, I'm a Spy. It was an unmitigated disaster, and the guy didn't even see why it was an unmitigated disaster. Curtis was supposed to set up his cover and wait for somebody in the Istanbul outpost to contact him, but nobody did. After a while, he got tired of waiting and found the outpost director by himself. By that point, the OSS brass had discovered how badly the outpost was leaking and was hauling most of the agents involved home by the scruffs of their necks. The director, Lanning McFarland, was holding on to his own position by his fingernails. Anyway, McFarland, perhaps recognizing that he was dealing with a motivated detective, or perhaps deciding to cover his embarrassment at being found by dumping on the finder a huge task that was sure to embarrass him, or perhaps just understaffed and desperate, responded to Curtis's sudden appearance by giving him surprising new orders. Curtis was told to build a local chapter of the X2 counter-espionage section of the OSS to replace the group of agents who were just fired. How? Just do it. You'll figure it out. X2 stands for double cross. It's a very important branch of spycraft. You want, as far as possible, not to destroy the enemy's spy networks, but to keep them in place and turn them so they work for you. And Curtis, totally unexpectedly, turned out to be very good at this. There's a lot of lying and backstabbing in academia, but this is another thing altogether. X2 stands for double cross. It's a very, His greatest moment came during the lead up to the Normandy invasion. At that time, the Allies were engaged in what you could call a ghost war. They were using every trick possible to confuse the Nazis as to where and when the invasion would be. Hollywood got involved, building whole decoy battalions and sending actors out to pretend to be soldiers and generals. From London to Marseille to Istanbul to Stockholm, spies burned their covers, worked up dazzling distractions, told more extravagant lies than they'd ever dared, and sent false information through double agents. The latter part was Joseph Curtis's job, but Curtis's unit didn't just turn enemy agents into double agents. It convinced many of them to become outright defectors. The defections were the real masterstroke of Istanbul's X2 agents. So many German Abwehr agents in Istanbul defected that Hitler, enraged, fired the head of the Abwehr, who had until now been his chief of intelligence, and then dissolved the Abwehr altogether, moving its agents into a police intelligence organization that had a totally different way of doing things. It was a drastic move at the worst possible time for the Germans. Right when the Allies were preparing for what everyone agreed might well be the decisive battle of the war, Hitler started making major changes to his intelligence system, destabilizing the Nazis' flow of intelligence. After the war, history would sing the praises of the double-cross system for its successes in maneuvering the Germans to play the game as the Allies wanted. But the double-cross unit in Istanbul managed to achieve something truly remarkable. It convinced Hitler over Washington. The historians, philologists, psychologists, economists, and other humanists of our day permanently changed the world of spycraft. They proved that, in Sherman Kent's words, well-trained scholars can find out 90% of what an intelligence agency needs to know, without even looking at secret sources. You just have to know how to do the reading. Sherman Kent was actually the perfect man for his job because his job entailed, in part, trying to convince the military to listen to what those tweedy professors were saying. And Kent, although he was himself a tweed-wearing professor, really should have been a drill sergeant. He was brilliant, but he was always looking for a fight. When he was teaching, he would throw chalk past the heads of his students, which they don't let us do anymore. And after he went to a spy training camp and learned how to throw daggers, he became so good at it that for the rest of his career, he was famous for being able to, quote, throw a knife better than a Sicilian. He was a man of superb and outrageous profanity, and he could talk to generals in their own language. All the work of the professors and librarians would have been nothing if he hadn't been their spokesman. After the war, Kent left academia and became the head of intelligence analysis for a new agency called the CIA. He wanted to prove to his colleagues that, as I said, well-trained scholars can find out 90% of what an intelligence agency needs to know. So he asked a group of Yale historians to spend the summer in Yale's library reading through publicly available documents and working out, using those documents alone, closely guarded military secrets. They succeeded at the task. The report they produced, which they formatted it as if they were sending it to Russia, just to be funny. You can see where this is going, right? The report they produced got leaked to Congress, which panicked because it thought that Yale professors were finding out military secrets for the Russians, and everybody got in a lot of trouble. An official from the CIA presented himself at the Yale Library and attempted to confiscate the library's entire contents. The librarians managed to convince him to take only the papers of the historians involved. It was a very silly episode, but Kent did prove he was right. Okay, so World War II changed the world in a lot of ways. It also changed the world of books. If you pick up a book that was published during World War II, the first thing you're likely to notice is that it feels very light, like a hollow prop. All right, not as heavy as you'd expect a book of its size to be. The war created a paper shortage that forced American publishers to change the paper they were using to a much thinner, lighter stock. The situation was far worse in Europe. Public debates arose in Britain about whether the government should start ransacking the nation's archives for paper. I'm passing around one of those books right now. You might notice how light it is, and you can see at the front a little announcement explaining why. Government wartime restrictions on materials have made it essential that the amount of paper used in each book be reduced to a minimum, etc., etc., etc. Here's another book, also printed on very light stock. This is an Armed Services edition of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, 100th anniversary this year. The books in this series were selected by the Council of Books in Wartime and distributed to the troops. I can't get you a copy of this because it's literally impossible to buy now, but here's a similar book of magic tricks that was distributed to the troops. All right? So, The Great Gatsby wouldn't be The Great Gatsby if not for World War II. Fitzgerald, at the time, was in what the kids would call his flop era. In 1940, the total sales for all of Fitzgerald's books was a whopping 72 copies. The total scholarly articles about his book could be counted on the fingers of both hands. The Armed Services editions got 155,000 copies of Gatsby into the hands of readers. But more importantly, the Armed Services editions proved to publishers that the paperback format works. After the war, Gatsby was reissued in all kinds of paperback imprints, and readers realized what a classic it was. Without paperbacks, there is no Gatsby. It's just not in the canon. The fate of literature is inextricable from the fate of books. That's not in the spy book, I just thought it was cool. Here is something that's in the spy book. This is the last, and in some ways, the most successful intelligence operation of the war. In early 1945, when a small and very secretive group of people knew that the atom bomb would be ready to drop before the end of the year, Vannevar Bush, the head of an agency in charge of coordinating war research at U.S. universities, summoned a Princeton professor named Henry DeWolf Smythe to a meeting in Washington. Bush asked Smythe, whose specialty was physics and who served as an advisor for the Manhattan Project, to write an account of the atom bomb, how it worked, how it was built, that could be given to the general public. This is that account. It's titled A General Account of the Development of Methods of Using Atomic Energy for Military Purposes under the Auspices of the United States Government, 1940 to 1945, and it was ready to go when atom bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. It was an immediate bestseller. Just for your amusement, this is the other book that was a bestseller. I think you'll see why you can't. This is the other book that was at the top of the bestseller lists in the fall of 1945, and you'll be able to guess from looking at the cover what it was that made this book so appealing to the reading public. The reason that the government asked Smythe to write his book was this. They knew that once the atom bomb was known to the world, the public would clamor for the story behind the weapon, and someone, a scientist who hadn't signed secrecy documents or a reporter, would provide it, unless the government told the story first. Smythe's book controlled the narrative. It was written to shape people's ideas of the atom bomb in such a way that other countries would find it harder to build one. Now, specifically what it did was it told a story about physicists, and almost solely about physicists. It told the Oppenheimer story that you've seen in the movies. The government knew that the physics of building an atomic bomb was the easiest part to figure out from basic principles, and also, from a certain perspective, the least important part. Far more important, at least for the problem, solving the problem of how to make the damned thing work, how to sustain atomic fission while a bomb is exploding, right? Were the heroic labors of chemists, engineers, and technicians in Chicago and Los Alamos, who then had their contributions swept from the historical record. Today, a popular term for World War II is the physicists' war, which just goes to show what a triumph this operation was. It was a misinformation coup, so successful that it still utterly dominates the way we think of the atomic bomb today. After the war, physics departments found themselves the beneficiaries of soaring enrollments, a flood tide of government funding, and the kind of attention normally afforded to Hollywood stars. After all, everyone knew that the war was, at bottom, a triumph of physicists. What I want to remind you, though, and this is my last lesson of spycraft, is that in matters worthy of great intelligence security, what everyone knows merits a little healthy skepticism. Like I told you earlier, secrets aren't secure. A better way to protect an asset than to just keep it secret is to spread misinformation. Now, I've been arguing to you that, what I've been arguing to you is that this wasn't just the physicists' war. It was also the historians' war, the book collectors' war, the artists' war. It was the professors' war. The war was fought on battlefields, but it was won in libraries. The librarians and professors that I've been talking about, and the intelligence analysis that emerged as the product of their work, represented something new in the world of intelligence. The United States invented intelligence analysis during World War II because it didn't have a standing intelligence agency and had to turn its disadvantage into an advantage by inventing something new. So it invented the concept of those men and women, book boffins, who were grabbed right out of libraries and universities, who were sitting in the basement of the Library of Congress. They used to be locked in the basement of the Library of Congress for days at a time, and working on problems that at first glance might seem laughably trivial. What's the best number of pellets to put in an anti-aircraft shell? What parts of a plane are worth reinforcing with extra armor? What percentage of rubber in German tank tires is synthetic? But here's the thing. The answers to those questions changed the course of the war. These men and women showed that working on supposedly small problems can yield big results. The thing about world-changing discoveries is they don't always come in world-shaking forms. So you learn about how they did their sideways thinking and how they pulled their intelligence out of incredibly unlikely sources in a library. This is a book by Yale anthropologists on how to survive if your plane goes down anywhere in the world. So they drew on sort of the knowledge about indigenous practices from all over the world. The far north, the far east, little islands in the Pacific. They said this is how you survive if your plane goes down everywhere, anywhere. So spectacular were their contributions that they changed the future of intelligence. And the United States recognized this. Before the war, US libraries were in their flop era. Underfunded, very thin collections in comparison to what was available in Europe, because the assumption had always been that if you needed something, you could just go to Europe, which of course turned out not to be the case in wartime. After the war, both university libraries and public libraries were invested in heavily by the US government, which was determined never to be caught so badly lacking again. The US had learned the value of libraries, not just as centers of community and education, but as something that's integral to national security. Unfortunately, today, 8 decades later, this is the 80th anniversary of our victory in World War II, we have forgotten that lesson. The question you tend to be asked after you write a book like this is, how did ordinary people find the courage to fight against this huge fascist regime? What I have learned, and what I believe, is that only ordinary people can fight this kind of fight. Or to be more tactical about it, the kinds of people whom Hitler would dismiss or overlook, like women, or Jewish people, or refugees, or factory workers, or professors, he didn't think much of professors, were exactly well positioned to run sabotage campaigns, or get information from people. Most informants don't know they're informants. or steal from libraries in Europe scientific books and journals, the latest research on atomic physics that they could send to the library at a little place in New Mexico called Los Alamos. These ordinary people, precisely by being ordinary people with a lot of courage, helped to give the Allies their greatest victories. During the D-Day invasion, German reinforcements could very easily have traveled to the Normandy coast and just wiped out the Allied soldiers in what was already a very difficult battle for the Allies to win. The reason the reinforcements didn't come is that a few hours before D-Day, ordinary people who belonged to the French resistance heard a code phrase over the radio, "The carrots are cooked," in French, of course, and then went outside and destroyed more than 900 sections of railroad. So the trains couldn't get to the Normandy coast. This huge battle depended on these ordinary people. Which brings me to my last point. One of the things I've learned while writing this book is that what you have is what you bring to the war. When your back is against the wall, you fall back on your training. The English had spy training schools that were incredibly posh. They had housemasters and servants and such because they were English. That's what they knew, so that's what they fell back on. The Americans had camps with tents where they were teaching people how to do quick draws like cowboys because they were Americans. Of course they trained like cowboys. The Norwegians were out there on skis. The French resistance robbed liquor stores, drank the wine, and then turned the bottles into Molotov cocktails. Because they're French. They fought as the French do. The librarians also fell back on their training, and it turned out to be unexpectedly exactly what modern intelligence needed. But more than this, the reserves of courage that ordinary people found to win a war against the Reich came from their love and values and struggles that they had before the war. Many of them were doing things like helping refugees before their country got into the war, or they were protesting Hitler's burning of books. The values they learned in peacetime in places like libraries gave them courage during the war. Which is one of the reasons that I'm so excited to be bringing out a book that argues that protecting our libraries is a national security issue. What you have is what you bring to the war. What we have in libraries is precious and irreplaceable. Thank you. Questions? That's my dealer. Back there, sir.
Thanks for an excellent presentation. Congratulations on the book. What got you interested in the subject matter at the beginning to write the book? And in the book you mentioned two warrior spies, Bill John and Bill Colby. Talk about both of them and the roles that they had growing up in various times.
I've been writing about universities for a long time. I became curious about why during the 1950s and 60s so many recruits to the CIA seemed to be coming from departments of history and literature. It turns out that literally all of their professors were spies in World War II, which seemed like an interesting story. And it was. It got more interesting the more I went into it. Look, R&A wouldn't have existed without William Donovan. He knew, he was the head of the OSS. He was tapped by Roosevelt, I think, to do it. And he knew as a lawyer that you have to do the reading before you go to court. He understood the importance of doing research, doing reading, understanding what it is that you're walking into. You know, lawyers never ask a question in court that they don't already know the answer to. So he asked for the OSS to build up R&A, this completely new type of intelligence branch that pulled researchers out of departments of the humanities, the social sciences, that pulled librarians out of libraries, and it turned out to be such a powerful idea that it became the basis of how intelligence is done today. So his training as a lawyer was sort of exactly perfect for what the moment needed. Yes?
Undoubtedly, a major source of the raw information were the libraries. And I believe that the German and the Axis powers did the same thing and look at their libraries for source of information. But not less important, after mining the information, is to refine it for the specific mission, because the same kind of information can be streamlined differently depending on what the mission is. So, do you have any information about how the streamlining occurred for the specific operation? And can you analogize, or can you make a comparison between what the Allied powers did and what the Axis power did in the matter of spying.
Yeah, I do talk in the book about the process by which people who are researchers or analysts for R&A, what exactly intelligence analysis comprises, and how it is that analysts take the raw material and turns it into reports. You know, the Axis, I don't think they had quite the same attitude toward libraries that the Allies had. They were doing book burnings for one thing. They were also, the Nazis were very greedy. I mean, very greedy as like personal individuals as well. So they would take sort of treasures from libraries. You know, they would go through all of the books that were in the Jewish ghettos, for example, or that were in a certain city that they were murdering all of the Jewish people in. They would have Jewish scholars go through those books and identify the books that were rare, that were of a high value. And the Nazis kept those. Not for their research value, not because they were trying to get a better understanding of the German people, but because they wanted to enrich themselves. Meanwhile, those same scholars were taking the books that they could, stuffing them down their pants, and sort of smuggling them home where they were buried, not with the expectation that they would dig those books up themselves, but in the hope that somebody one day would dig them up and remember that there used to be a people living here. So there were very different attitudes, I think, towards books and towards libraries that were exhibited by either side, and I think that came out in the end in the Allies' willingness to embrace scholars who were, for example, refugees, scholars who were Jewish themselves. The Economic Warfare Division in Manhattan had black researchers in it. The OSS was 34% women, and they were not merely working as secretaries, although secretaries, of course, were not just shuffling papers back then. They were doing computational work and that sort of thing as well. What I'm trying to say is the willingness to have...
Most defended places in Europe by the Germans was Berlin on one hand and the oil fields in Romania. Because without energy, the tanks and the cars, nothing could move. So can you elaborate about, apparently the oil played an even more important role than the wheel bearing, which was second strategically important.
The Nazis had some correct ideas about military strategy, and they had some deeply incorrect ideas about military strategy. Another country that Hitler was absolutely convinced that he had to keep a grip on was Norway, because he had read a book that said that the Germans lost World War I because they weren't able to keep a grip on Norway. So he had read this important book. You know what I mean? You ever meet a guy who's read a book? But the Allies used that to their advantage. They started Operation Fortitude, which was this whole operation that was designed to convince Hitler that when the D-Day landings happened, because they all knew that the Allies had to try and land on continental Europe at some point, it was going to happen in Norway. And Hitler believed this because it was feeding into what he already believed. You know what I mean? Yeah, a lot of things, the oil fields, North Africa, Norway. Like I said, the Nazis had some correct ideas about military strategy, but they also had a lot of deeply incorrect ideas about military strategy. And also the D-Day landings, they happened a day or so late because of weather, but the Germans were so convinced they were not going to happen at the time that they happened that one of the big German generals was actually going for a vacation with his family when the landings happened. So, yeah.
Specifically send specific information to the Nazis to make them think that the invasion was going to be in Norway instead.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%, all of the time. They set up, entire fake battalions in Scotland, right? Because Scotland, you could kind of get to Norway more easily. So they didn't want to waste actual soldiers, so they had Hollywood actors wearing uniforms, marching around, going well, here I am, a big important general in Scotland. They had fake ships, which had fake laundry hanging out on the ships belonging to the sailors. Yeah, so what the Germans did was they would send, sentry planes to go and see what was happening in Scotland, which is another thing that Hollywood could do right, because the planes were not looking to see the people down there. They were taking pictures. So back then, photographic technology, have you ever seen an old-style Hollywood actress for a black and white movie, and her makeup is actually just shades of green and blue? Have you ever seen that? because that's what it was like. It wouldn't photograph properly as, you know, as blush or something like that. So you had to have Hollywood types, like people who were experts in you know, film. Painting, you know, the fake grass couldn't be green, that wouldn't photograph properly. It had to be a certain shade of pink, you know. So you had people who were doing camouflage, which was this completely new thing that had been invented by a bunch of artists and painters. The military types did not like camouflage. They thought it was sissy. They were like, that's a little, you know. But it worked, you know. The artists' ideas of camouflage worked. The Hollywood types convinced Hitler to amass a ton of forces in Norway, which meant that they weren't in France when the D-Day landings happened. And then while the D-Day landings were happening, those Hollywood types convinced Hitler that the D-Day landings were not happening. That in fact, this was a fake invasion force meant to distract him before they got Norway. So he still thought it was going to be Norway while the D-Day invasion in France was happening. We owe Hollywood a big thank you for that. Yes, back there.
Thank you for an excellent and very informative presentation. Would be interested in your thoughts about modern technologies and the potential applicability that they might have, or have they become passé, or are they still relevant?
Sherman Kent was of the opinion, and I tend to agree, that nothing is going to replace like the human as a strategist, as an analyst, that sort of thing. And I will point out, just in the humble area of, for example, computer hacking, right? Most hacking, which is the same sort of thing, right? It's penetrating, you know, somebody else's forces in order to get their intelligence. It doesn't usually take the form of like rat-a-tat-a-tat, I'm in, you know what I mean? It usually takes the form of, I'm going to put some malware on a thumb drive. I'm going to drop the thumb drive in the parking lot of my enemy. And then somebody gets out of their car, they pick up the thumb drive. It has their company's logo on it, naturally. So they say, oh, someone in my company dropped this thumb drive. I'm going to stick it into my computer and see who it belongs to. And then your malware is in their computer, and suddenly you have all of their stuff, you know? Or it takes the form of following somebody into their hotel and waiting for them to say what their room number is. And then going up to their floor and opening up a Wi-Fi hotspot that's called like this hotel Wi-Fi. They log into the Wi-Fi, and then you use like, you know, you can monitor their work very closely if they're using your Wi-Fi network. What I'm trying to say is most intelligence gathering today, regardless of whether you are a computer hacker or somebody who is working in something like, you know, CIA-style intelligence, still takes the form of old-fashioned fooling people. You know what I mean? Still takes the form of, most informants don't know that they're informants. Do you want to know how to get information from people without being remembered as somebody who asks a lot of questions? You say the wrong thing very confidently, and you wait for them to correct you. All right? You say, actually, you know, I know why they bought a bunch of that kind of submarine, because it has this feature. You're in a bar that a lot of Navy guys go to, right? And then the Navy guy beside you will go, that's not how that kind of submarine works at all. Listen. You know, it helps if you're a pretty girl, by the way. You know, tell me more about submarines. You know? This was explicitly taught to people during World War II. There are materials during World War II that say, hey, you need to be a girl and pretend to be wrong about something, and then men will sit you down and explain things and feel like really smart and authoritative. This was a strategy that they used back then. It's a strategy that the Russians used against the Americans during World War II. And, you know, darn it, it's a strategy that still works today. I sometimes, when I'm looking for an answer on the internet, will go on to a message board, and I won't ask a question, I'll say the wrong thing, and then everyone swoops in to correct me. It's a much more efficient way to get information. So in short, you know, I teach some computer science myself. I even teach hacking myself, which students enjoy because they like to do crime. And most hacking consists of confidence games and burglary. And I think it's the same for intelligence too. So I don't think humans are outmoded just yet. I don't think ChatGPT is going to be able to go in there and get what we need out of Russia and North Korea. It's my suspicion. Yes?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the cover names that were given in training camps. I found that part of the book very interesting. You mentioned how, you know, it could be like first, middle, or last name is somewhere in the cover name.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's just totally like random.
Yeah.
Did you ever find a good method for, when you're in the personnel files, for matching those names where it's just random to the actual human being's name?
So the files are ordered like under the person's government name. So I never had a problem matching the code name, you know,
Okay.
from. So Joseph Curtis, his student name was Joe. I guess I think, you know, okay, Joe, that doesn't sound necessarily like a Connecticut Yale guy, I can kind of see that. But, you know, so no, I personally didn't have a problem matching the cover name with the actual person. But if the files had been organized in a different way, of course I would have had a lot of trouble and had to try to come up with some sort of method. Another interesting thing about going by cover names, which of course people did in training camps because you don't want the other students when they're being tortured by the Gestapo to name all of their classmates, right? Is this. One, academia is a small world. I'd even suggest that library land is a small world. So you're there, you know, with your entering class of people who are training to be spies, you're under cover names, but you look over and it's like this guy from your department, you know? This happened. You can read about this in the memoirs. You know, you see somebody else and you'd be like, oh, I guess we just don't know each other anymore. They have to pretend to, like, you know, kill each other during the training. I'm sure that a lot of departmental feuds were worked out in various ways. And the other part of it is that the students' real identities were also not given to the people who were doing the training, because the people who were doing the training were supposed to work with a completely blank slate as to what this person's capabilities were. You got a report card in killing, you know what I mean? You got to report, how good are you at killing people? How good are you at getting information out of people? How good are you at spreading rumors? To be a rumor spreader, which was called whispering, you had to be specially trained to do it, all right? By the way, the principles of whispering, which I describe in the book, are pretty much exactly how Twitter works, so take that as you will. But anyway, so the people got to camp, they immediately had to change into, you know, their uniforms. But the staffers, people are very sneaky, right? People are very nosy. So they would look at the shoes and the socks, because the students often changed into those last. And they would try to figure out what sort of person you were from your shoes and your socks. So, you know, a motivated detective can use almost anything to try and find out information about a person. I see that you have Oxford shoes that are laced properly, so I know you had a good education and made a decent income, but other than that, I'm not sure. I'd have to... all right, when I say laced properly, I'm referring to straight lacing. I'm not being condescending, I'm just actual. Okay, guys, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.